Well, hello and welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about the bizarre history of Wisconsin from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. So you should be able to see right now the bizarre history of Wisconsin, the program we're going to explore this evening. And as you heard, my name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, alien abductions, really weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just a little strange and offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore this evening. Some of Wisconsin's strangest history that you may not be aware of. Of course, if you listen to the rest of the country, they believe Wisconsin is weird in its own right, because the rest of the country believes that Wisconsin is weird because we're all dairy farmers and that they believe we're all crazy Packer fans and we do nothing but eat cheese and drink beer. And even though this last one may be true for a lot of people, I'm going to be talking about a different Wisconsin, a more bizarre, a more sinister, certainly more entertaining history of our state. I'm going to be talking about some of the weirdest stories from the 1800s through the early 1900s. So, for the next 45 or 50 minutes, we will explore some of the weirdest stories that Wisconsin has to offer. What exactly are we going to talk about this evening? Well, everything from bizarre deaths and ghosts down to medical anomalies, psychic phenomena, and UFOs. I've also thrown in what I call keep in minds, things that are interesting about the state that you might not have known. For instance, in the time period in which we're operating in, Wisconsin had about 775,000 people in it. Today, we have about 6 million people in our state. So back then, they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird. And believe me, they took full advantage of that weirdness. First stop, bizarre deaths. Today, if you open up your newspaper and flip to the obituary section, you will probably see something similar to this. Old man Lewis died peacefully surrounded by his loving family. No cause of death, no information, nothing else in the obituary. But the era in which I was looking at these obituaries, I was finding they were a little bit different, because I was finding ones like suicide is gruesome, whole top of his head blown off by the blast. Quite a bit different than dying peacefully surrounded by your loving family. And this got me really interested in how they perceived death in the old days and how they sold newspapers, which is why you get articles like this one, Cold Bath Causes Death. Now, I chose this article for several reasons. One, it's going to come back later in the program. Someone must have read this story and changed their behavior. But two, the story talks about Miss Carrie Davenport of Beloit having the habit of taking a cold bath each morning. Now, most likely she died of a brain aneurysm or a heart attack, but that didn't sell newspapers. Cold bath causes death sold newspapers. But the odd part was, I didn't find this in the Beloit newspaper. I found it in the Eau Claire newspaper, and I found that quite a bit. Oftentimes, something was said to have happened in La Crosse, but it appeared in the Superior newspaper or vice versa. And it makes you wonder, did the story really happen? Or was it a slow news day in Eau Claire in 1903, and they made the story up knowing nobody would Google them back then? So half the fun of this program is wondering, did these stories really happen? They appeared in the newspaper, but are they real? That I'll leave it up to you to come to your own conclusion. But when we hear of these people dying in the old days, we can't feel too bad because keep in mind in 1900, the average life expectancy here in the US was only 47 years of age. So when they died at a young age, they weren't missing out on a lot of life expectancy as we would if we passed today. This next story, I have dozens of these cases, and it talks about somebody seeing death coming. He had a premonition that he was going to die, so he went around telling everybody the exact time and day he was going to die. And sure enough, when that day came, he did, in fact, pass on. Now, what I'd like about this story, opposed to all the other ones I've collected about people having premonitions of their own death, is the fact that the newspaper said that before he died, he went out and did one last thing before he died. And that last thing was he went out and paid off every single one of his debts so that when he died, he could die with a clear name. Take that versus today. If somebody knows they're going to die, they're probably on a cruise or a vacation, something much different than the old days. But it was also not only that you had to fear death, you had to fear being buried alive. In the 1900s, people were terrified of being buried alive. And it's a great story. It's a great urban legend. But is it anything more than that? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem silly today with modern science and medicine, but our grandparents, they were so terrified of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions. My favorite is this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell that you could have above your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke in time and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is tug that rope. It would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived at the cemetery that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention, though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone was buried alive. In the old days, it was your responsibility when a loved one passed to sit around their grave for several days and nights, making sure that they weren't coming up from the dead. They weren't rising back to the living. Now, I'm going to move on from bizarre deaths, not because I don't find them fascinating, I do, but because they're dangerous. I found many cases where people were merely talking about death when all of a sudden they drop dead, as though all you have to do is discuss the idea of death and the Grim Reaper will come after you. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next category while I still can. And that is ghost and haunted locations. Today, you can't throw a rock in Wisconsin without hitting a place that has a haunted story. Many of these go back many, many generations, including this story of a place near Eau Claire called Mary Dean. It's an old island on the river named after a young girl who drowned while coming up on a steamboat many years ago. She was buried, it was said, in an unmarked grave on the island. At one time, an entire town lived on the island. They had a post office and many businesses as well. Now it's abandoned. But many believe it's not empty because the legend talks about the ghost of Mary Dean being out in the water and that her spirit acts like a siren trying to entice you into the water by saying things like, "Help, I can't swim, save me, don't leave me, don't let me drown." The legend is if you're foolish enough to go into the water, she will pull you under and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity with Mary Dean. The best part of this story is the fact that you can camp on Mary Dean if you like. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay. You can simply camp and see if the spirit of Mary Dean will pay you a visit. Back in 1874, the good people of the Fox Valley, Appleton area had no idea while reading the obituary of Mrs. George M. Miller that it would lead to one of the most haunted areas in Wisconsin today. It's in Appleton at a place called Riverside Cemetery, home of Mrs. Miller, better known as Kate Blood. It was said that when she was alive, Kate Blood murdered her husband and their 3 young children. Therefore, she would not be allowed burial inside the cemetery proper. And she is in a secluded area all by herself by the river. If you were not specifically looking for her gravesite, you probably would not find it. But that's not the scary part. The scary part comes in the fact that those who visit the cemetery have odd things take place while they're there. Mysterious balls of light, disembodied voices, all kinds of odd activity while they walk the Stations of the Cross that runs parallel to the river. It's also said that when you go to the gravesite, many have seen what appears to be a hooded figure standing behind the grave. But when they try to get a closer look to see who or what he may be, he simply vanishes into thin air. Others tell that when you go to the gravesite, you will see the blood of Kate ooze out of the gravestone. And I say it appears to be blood because witnesses I've spoken with who claim to have seen this phenomenon claim that when they went to touch this blood, it was dry to the touch, even though they swore it was liquid coming out of the gravestone. Well, I spent months and months researching this case to find out that Kate did not murder her husband. Well, actually, I just read the tombstone. You can see here that her husband lived much longer than she did, and she did not kill their children. She was thought to be an upstanding member of the community. But even though the origin story of this haunting is a little inaccurate, the legends continue. For some people, seeing equals believing, but for others, it may equal believing equals seeing. I love this category, medical anomalies. Things today that we could probably explain with science, but back then, they had no idea what was going on, including this case where a gentleman was turning white again. Out of Kenosha, he was a tannery employee who suddenly started turning black. They thought it was due to a chemical action in the tannery. But I have all kinds of these stories of people changing colors of their skin, looking more Caucasian at some point, more African American, and somewhere in any spectrum in between, changing colors, and doctors were baffled back then. They had no idea what was going on. Keep in mind, the hamburger was invented in Seymour, Wisconsin, home of the hamburger. You can go there and see a large roadside attraction of the hamburger as well. This next case I call Good News, Bad News, and I have dozens upon dozens of them. And it talks about sight returning just before death of a woman in Wausau. Said 20 years ago she went blind. Then all of a sudden, she received her ability to see again. Doctors were puzzled. They explained it as a special act of providence, an act of God, a spiritual, religious healing. But I said I have a lot of these, and they're always good news, bad news. And I call them that because no matter what seems to return, whether it's your sense of smell, your hearing, your ability to walk, talk, or see, it usually means that death is coming for you shortly after. 99% of the cases I found that after somebody received something back, gained the ability that they had lost, death followed them very shortly. So I call them good news, bad news. Good news is you can see again. Bad news is you're going to see the Grim Reaper coming after you. What about this odd case? Flesh like bone, talking about a woman whose bones started turning and flesh started turning rock hard as they were bone all over her. I tried to follow up to see what happened with this woman, but a lot of times these stories were very difficult to find once again. They were reported and never reported on in the future. Imagine flipping through the newspaper when you see this headline. Is a human monster. Child is half dog and half man. The body was covered with hair and had a long projecting nose and a low forehead. The mother loved it, but here's the weird thing. It was said that the mother was scared by a dog jumping on her about a month ago. Back in those days, when a woman was pregnant, if she was scared by any animal, whether it was a snake or an elephant, in some weird maternal imprinting, that child would come out looking like the animal that scared the mother. So, of course, this mother was scared by a dog jumping on her. So she came out with a half dog, half young man boy that was born. Although no photographs of it were taken, apparently. Most likely, this wasn't a half dog and half human. Most likely, the child was born with a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis that, when afflicted with this disorder, those people usually grow hair all over their face and upper torso of their bodies. Back then, they would be put on display as freaks of nature at the dime museums. If they were lucky, their parents would allow them to run away with the circus with people like P.T. Barnum from the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus, and later Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And the reason I said if they were lucky their parents would allow them to go, and they would, is because they knew they'd have a much better life on the road with these men than they would back on the farm in Wisconsin. They would make a lot of money and live a pretty fulfilling life. In fact, at one time, both P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature, as they were called, General Tom Thumb, were two of the wealthiest men in America. Or what about this? Chicken has a human face out of Preston. It was said that the newspaper claimed that many offers of huge amounts of money were proposed to the farmer who had it, but the farmer would not sell, instead charging people to come see this freak of nature, or this anomaly, if you will. Which leads us right into the category of mysterious creatures. Creatures that science says do not exist. Skeptics claim they can't exist. Yet every year, hundreds of people were coming face to face with these creatures. A lot of you are watching this right in the Racine area. Here's an odd case of 1902 talking about an odd fish that was taken out of Lake Michigan. Had the head of a lizard and the body of a fish, 14 inches long, 2.5 inches in diameter. Here's the weird thing. When it was in water with other fish, it emitted some strange pills that dissolved and killed the other fish. Nobody could explain what it was, which is par for the course during those days, because in the late 1800s, Wisconsin was overrun with reports of sea serpents, giant lake monsters in the lakes, rivers, and streams of Wisconsin. If you were a resort town in the 1800s and you did not have a legend of a sea serpent, you were behind the times. And out of all the lakes that I receive reports of giant monstrosities in, I receive more out of Lake Michigan than all the other lakes in Wisconsin. For hundreds and hundreds of years, people have seen odd things in the lake. Just rummaging through the old newspapers, you'll see dozens and dozens and dozens of newspaper accounts of people seeing something that they can't explain. One of my favorite sightings happened in 1900 down by the shoreline. It was here that a group of men were working with their horse and buggy. They had no idea that for decades people were seeing some strange monster in the water. But when they went down to the water, they saw something bigger than their horse and buggy combined. They immediately ran to grab all of their equipment, their weapons. They wanted to kill it because they didn't think any of their friends would believe them. But when they came back to the shoreline, the thing simply descended into the depths of Lake Michigan and was not seen by those construction workers the rest of the time they were there. Skeptics claim that everyone seeing the sea serpent were mistaking it for a school of carp. Or if that wasn't good enough for you, it had to be a sea lion or an escaped animal from Adam Forepaw's traveling circus show, even though Forepaw himself claimed he was not missing any of his circus performers, animals, or people. What's inhabiting Lake Michigan, this giant leviathan of the deep? I'll leave it up to you to tickle your feet and toes in the water and dip them in and see what might just bite at the bait. Keep in mind, Wisconsin claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before we get too excited, so do the states of Minnesota, California, Maine, Michigan, and of course the country of Canada. But we all know Paul and Babe are from Wisconsin. But a lot of people have no idea how Paul met Babe. And Paul met Babe during the terrible winter of the blue snow. The weather was so bad, the temperatures were so freezing cold that people swore a blue streak so long that it turned all the snow blue. They actually recorded as that year having 2 winters because it was so brutal and so long. It was so cold that winter. What's that? How cold was it? It was so cold that winter that fish grew fur to stay warm. That's how cold it was when Paul found Babe. Babe was out in the snow, and he had already turned blue and from being stuck in the snow. So Paul took him into his lumber camp, nursed him back to health, and like everything around Paul Bunyan, Babe grew to an enormous size, and the rest, as they say, is history, as Paul and Babe have made their way through the Midwest lumber camps ever since. And speaking of lumbermen, this gentleman, Eugene Shepard of Rhinelander, was responsible for one of the weirdest creatures people believed in the 1800s, and that was the hodag, this giant lizard-like beast with claws, fangs, horns, and spikes going all the way down its back into its tail. Shepard claimed that these creatures were roaming the Northwoods from Maine to the West Coast. But not only that, he claimed that he had seen them personally. People thought it was bizarre. That is, until he claimed to have caught one, and he brought it into town and started showing it and displaying it at local fairs and county gatherings and carnivals. He would charge people to come see a fake hodag he had created, and then he brought it to his house where he had his kids operating it in a pit, and people would pay to come and see it. Even to this very day, I receive reports from people asking, how do I go see a hodag? Where can I find them? Believing that the creature is real. Of course, Eugene Shepard never admitted that he hoaxed it. He said the only reason he created one is because he couldn't catch the real one. They were too dangerous. That's why he made up his fake one, but the hodag, in his word, was real as can be. Keep in mind, Green Bay is the oldest city in Wisconsin, incorporated in 1754. A lot of you are travelers and you say, wait a minute, Chad. I pass through Abbotsford all the time. They claim to be Wisconsin's first city, which they are, alphabetically speaking, but they're not the first when you look at the year they were incorporated. But until some other city renames themselves, Abbotsford does have a claim of being Wisconsin's first city. Imagine finding this article: freak animal, the head belonging to that of a cat and the body of that of a rabbit. But again, this was 1910. You would think that if there was a new species, especially one as cool as being part rabbit and part cat existed, somebody would have snapped a photograph of it. But as of today, there is no known photograph of this mysterious monster. I love this category. This category, the stories were so bizarre, they didn't fit into any other category. So I put them in their own category, including, keep in mind, Old Abe, the supernatural bird of the Civil War. During the Civil War, every state could bring a mascot with them. Wisconsin chose to bring Old Abe, an eagle from north of the Eau Claire area. And Old Abe grabbed a reputation right away as being a supernatural bird, saying that whoever was carrying Old Abe would be protected, that they would never be shot or killed while they were carrying Old Abe. And in fact, Old Abe made it through the entire war. Southern generals said they'd rather kill Old Abe than to capture many Northern soldiers, because that's what Old Abe did for the morale of the North. Once Old Abe finished the war, he eventually passed on and was stuffed and put in the state capitol, where unfortunately he was lost, the stuffing, when one of the Capitol fires took him out. But they have a replica still in the Capitol. A lot of people like to talk about Whitewater and all the legends of Whitewater, known as Second Salem, because of all the legends that go on in the town. One of my favorite stories is the story that involves the university library, and in some accounts, the Whitewater Public Library. And it is said that in one of these libraries is a strange book that they keep under lock and key, because they had so many problems with people checking it out, because it was a book of the dead, that when you checked this book out, it was cursed. You would die either in a bizarre accident or at your own hands. I don't know who kept returning it, because everyone kept dying, but that's the legend. Now, what's interesting is it was said that it was finally put under lock and key after dozens of students, faculty, and staff checked it out, and they all died on the campus. And every year I receive reports from the librarian saying, We do not have this book. It's a folklore, it's a legend. Do not send people here looking for it, which is exactly what you would expect those sneaky librarians to tell you. So I recommend you show up demanding to see the Book of the Dead. Just make sure you have plans for someone to return it once you meet your end. Or what about in Appleton, raining horned toads? People woke up and found all these toads all over the city. And what was weird is the toads were not to be found anywhere in the area. They could only be found, as you can read here, from semi-tropical portions of the Southwest. How they got to Appleton, nobody knows. Skeptics claim that what happened was big thunderstorms or a tornado took off in the Southwest, scooped up all these horned toads, came to Appleton, lost its power, and dropped them everywhere. The only problem with that theory is that there were no other animals that were dropped, no other fish, no other reptiles, no insects, nothing but these horned toads. Or what about the 8-foot skeleton found in Ferryville? Prehistoric man, meaning Native American, measuring 8 or 9 or maybe even longer or taller, has been unearthed in 1909. And imagine something 9 feet high at that time, because keep in mind the average height of an American male in 1909 was only 5 feet 6 inches. In fact, the largest person ever on record is that of Robert Wadlow of Alton, Illinois. He died while still growing. He was a wee bit short of being 9 feet tall when he died. They have a life-size statue of him in Alton. You can go and see how gigantic he was. And they also have one at Ripley's, believe it or not, auditorium in Wisconsin Dells. They found the body of this giant in an effigy mound. Now, keep in mind, the effigy mounds, which we once thought to have had 20,000 of them in Wisconsin, were native burial grounds. They were mounds raised up, usually in the shape of an animal that could best be viewed from the sky. Unfortunately, less and less, or fewer and fewer of these are being protected, and we're losing them because of sprawl, agriculture, and beyond. I love this story. Religious books cause insanity. A young boy in Superior went insane, according to his friends and family, because every time someone came over, he said, "Do you want to talk with the angels? I can talk with them, the guardian angels. I'll let them know if you have any questions or concerns." And it got to be so much, they thought he was insane, and they put him in an insane asylum. But I don't think this young man was insane. I simply believe he was ahead of his time. Because in 1905, if you told people you could talk to angels, they would and did put you in an insane asylum. But today, you can make a pretty good living giving angel readings for people, telling them what the angels want to impart on their life. Keep in mind, during Prohibition, all the biggest name gangsters flooded to Wisconsin for vacation. Everyone from Al Capone to George Bugs Moran to John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Alvin Creepy Karpus, Ma Barker and the gang. All the big name gangsters came to Wisconsin for a little fun and vacation. What about cases of suicide? Not human suicide, but animal suicide. This talks about a case in La Crosse where a dog went into a saloon, and apparently people were mean to it and said, "Get out of here, you old mutt," and started kicking it. Those who saw it said the dog went down to the railroad tracks and waited and waited. And when a train came rumbling by, it put its head down on the tracks and refused, even at the engineer's whistle, to leave the tracks, where it eventually was run over and killed. Those who saw it declared it was a case of animal suicide. Or an old clock stops when the owner dies. It had been in the family for 40 years until the man the grandfather of the family, passed away at 4:25. Guess what time the clock stopped working? You got it, 4:25. I have dozens of these cases, and people still contact me saying that when they found out a loved one passed away, the watch stopped, or their stove, the oven, the clock on there stopped when they get a call talking about a loved one passing on. How or why this happens, I have no idea. Don't worry, you're not going to see any of your neighbors or in-laws in this section. It's too long ago. But Wisconsin has a long history of unique people coming from our state. Keep in mind, the Ringling Brothers staged their first show in Baraboo in 1884. And if you've never been to Baraboo Circus World Museum, you're missing out. It's a real treasure. Not only do they have a running circus all summer long, you can go and enjoy along the banks of the Baraboo River, but they also have more circus memorabilia than anywhere else in the entire world. From all the old circus wagons to the tapestry to the advertisements, the costumes, you name it, it's the grand museum of all circus memorabilia and lore. Now we get to a part where some monsters in Wisconsin are not like sea serpents, because some monsters, they tend to look a little more like this. Now, if you're not familiar with this gentleman, loosely given that phrase, this is Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin. And if you don't know Ed's story, you might recall some of the movies they based on his life, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and many, many others. Now, most just remember Ed as a murderer, and true he was, but he also loved to go down to the local cemeteries and dig up the remains of women that reminded him of his own deceased mother. He would then bring those remains back to his farmhouse where he lived in squalor. I'm not going to get into the details of what Ed did with those bodies, some of which he used for lampshades and furniture, but they found skulls all over his house. When he really got a bug in his system, what Ed would do is make an entire outfit of this material, and he would wear it like a demented Halloween costume as he danced under the moonlight in his front yard. But when we captured Gein and discovered how truly evil his crimes were, they wanted to open his house as a museum of horrors that you could go see. But before they were able to do so, it mysteriously burned to the ground. Townsfolk torched it, allegedly. But Gein was deemed a monster all over the world. And for good reason, he was a monster. But 50 years before Gein was digging up bodies, a young girl in Madison was wearing human skin, but she was getting compliments for it. She received a bunch of material, human skin, from a friend of hers who was a doctor student in Chicago, and sent her the skin of a man that was killed in the streets, an unknown man, which she made shoes out of that were light tan in color. And according to the newspaper, everywhere she went, people complimented her on the beauty of her shoes. She said she has enough material left over that she was going to make a handbag to go along with the shoes. What happened to those shoes? We have no idea. Perhaps they're in your basement or your attic right now. We have no idea whatsoever. Keep in mind, we have nearly 15,000 lakes here in Wisconsin, which is more than the nearly 12,000 that Minnesota has, even though they're known as the land of the 10,000 lakes. But partly this is how we measure our lakes versus how they measure theirs. If they measured lakes the same criteria we measure lakes, well, it would be no competition. They have a lot more lakes than we do. Remember the first story? Cold bath causes death? This next gentleman must have read that story because he didn't like baths. In fact, he went 60 years without taking one. He was 62 at the time, so you can imagine how long he went without taking a bath. But in those days, times were tough. But I think this next story, the person took it a little too far. And it was 1907, a woman's husband died, and she asked the dentist to remove her husband's false teeth. Not because she wanted them to remember her husband by, but what she wanted is for the dentist to take out her dead husband's teeth and remold them to fit into her mouth. The reason she wanted this is that now that her husband was dead, she said she had to get back into the dating game, and that having new teeth in her mouth would attract more suitors to court her. And guess what? The dentist did it. He reformed them into her mouth. Whether or not she received more suitors, I have no idea. Psychic phenomena. This was a popular category of things going on for people of that day, including people who believed that their location could be cursed. Here's one out of the Fox Valley where they talked about this farm that had all kinds of bizarre deaths, all kinds of weird accidents. They thought it was cursed. This was from 1907. But a few years ago, I was doing a radio program, an interview in the Fox Valley area, and a person called up and said, I live on that farm. That's my family's farm. These curses, these accidents, they're still happening. This is not from the past. It's happening today. Of course, a lot of you watching here are married, and without a doubt, you're happily married. But if you know somebody who's not happily married, they may want to try what this next young woman tried, because she claimed she was hypnotized into marriage. She claimed her husband hypnotized her. And when they went to court, her husband admitted, yes, I hypnotized her into marriage. You could try it today. I don't know what a judge would think of that excuse today, but if you're in an unhappy marriage and you're looking to get out, maybe give it a try. UFOs, the last category we're going to talk about this evening. Unidentified flying objects. Today, people believe, and skeptics claim, the only reason people see UFOs, the only reason people believe in UFOs is because of Hollywood. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day. That's why we believe in UFOs. Hollywood has trained us to believe in them. But what you'll see here in the next few cases is that people in Wisconsin were seeing odd things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. And it should come as no surprise that we have reports of UFOs, because not only does Wisconsin have the UFO capital of the world, we have 3 of them. The cities of Bellevue, Dundee, and Elmwood all claim to be the UFO capital of the world. All 3 of them have UFO Day festivals where you can go there and decide for yourself whether UFOs are visiting these cities. But weird things were being seen in the sky. Here's a case out of 1895 in Green Bay talking about a big ball of fire hanging in the horizon for about 10 minutes before disappearing. And I threw the photo on the bottom not because it shows Green Bay or a UFO, but it illustrates how much more time people spent outside back then than we do today. Nearly half the population was involved in farming. Today, that's less than 1%. And they spent more time outside. At night, when in the summer, when their house was too hot, they'd sit outside waiting for it to cool off. If it didn't, they'd sleep out in their front yard. So it makes sense they were seeing things more than we are today because they were looking more than we are today. Just as an experiment, mentally for the next week or so, keep track of how long you spend staring at the night sky. And if you're like most people, especially in winter, it's probably not that long. Or this case out of Appleton, people thought it was a floating airship flying over. 100 people saw it, and they could not decipher what it was. Wasn't a cloud nor a balloon. Who knows what they were seeing? This next case is a little more recent than the rest, but because it's so bizarre and so weird, I had to include it. It happened in Eagle River in 1961 to this gentleman, Joel Simonton, a plumber and part-time farmer who was having a late morning breakfast one morning when he looked out his window and he noticed what appeared to be some sort of craft descending into his yard. As he walked out, he noticed a hatch appeared on the craft. This thing landed or hovered in his backyard. He said it was about 20 or 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, had all these little mufflers on it, these little depression type rings. He said a door appeared and a man or an alien inhabitant, whatever it was, came to the front and he could see two others on board. They were all dressed identical. They were all very small, dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin. He said they reminded him of small Italian men. Simonton realizes one of them has a jug and realizes without any communication, verbally that is, that they need water. So he goes to his house, fills the jug up with water, and when he comes back, he hands the water, but he sees one of these things seems to be cooking something over a flameless type grill or apparatus. Simonton motions with his hand like eating, pointing, like, "Are you going to eat that?" And the leader recognizes Simonton's interest, goes over and hands him a few of these things and trades him for the water. And then they close the door and fly off. And Simonton's left there holding what the media was calling these alien pancakes or saucer cakes. He traded them for the water. I told you this was going to be a weird case. Simonton ate one, said it was the worst tasting thing he had ever had. Said no wonder they're so small if this is what they're eating. Meanwhile, other people were reporting flying saucers around the state, and some in Eagle River as well. Until the day he died, Simonton believed he had encountered something not of this earth. And these stories continue on. Every year, my colleague Noah Voss receives hundreds of reports on his website UFO Wisconsin. But as I'm running low on time this evening, I hope this is what you take from tonight's program. That you may turn on your television, listen to NPR, open up your newspaper, or God forbid you consult the internet. And you'll say something like this: "Can you believe how crazy the world is? The world has gone bonkers." And I agree with you 100%. The world today is absolutely insane. But I hope this program illustrates that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. It will probably be crazy 100 years from now when they look back at us and wonder what the heck we were doing. So the next time you feel like shouting how weird and unusual the world is, think back to this program, calm down, and realize the world has always been weird. And with that, if you want more information, my website, Chad Lewis Research, has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I really hope your adventure does not end here with this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen, you'll meet some odd people, and along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library again for having me here. I can't think of a time in U.S. history in which the library has played a more important role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, societal issues, politics, the library is the fabric that keeps our community together. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of them. If you didn't like the program, let them know so you get fewer. But either way, to show my appreciation, if you want to go to my website and get any of my books, just type in the coupon code LIBRARY. You'll save 20% off everything just because the library is so amazing.